Eleanor Parker believed that a mother's heart never truly rests, no matter how old her child becomes, and on that quiet Sunday morning in her small Ohio home, her unease arrived without warning, slipping into her chest as she stood alone in the laundry room listening to the steady hum of the dryer, a sound that usually calmed her but now felt too loud, too empty, because Daniel had not called in days, and that absence pressed on her thoughts harder than any noise ever could. She folded a blue shirt she recognized as his from years ago, one he had left behind during his last visit, and the fabric carried a faint trace of familiar cologne that made her pause, her fingers tightening as memories rose uninvited, memories of a boy who once told her everything, who used to call just to talk about nothing, who laughed easily and trusted deeply, and she wondered when that openness had quietly slipped away. She tried to reason with herself, reminding her heart that grown men had busy lives, demanding jobs, and complicated marriages, especially Daniel, who worked long hours and lived hours away in Toronto, but logic failed against the sharp pull of instinct that whispered something fragile was breaking in his life. Eleanor had survived her own heartbreak decades earlier, a betrayal she never spoke of but never forgot, and that old wound stirred now, aching as if it sensed danger nearby. She poured herself coffee she barely tasted and sat at the kitchen table staring at her phone, willing it to ring, replaying their last conversation when Daniel's voice sounded tired, careful, almost distant, and when she asked if everything was all right, he answered too quickly, like someone hiding a crack behind a smile. Outside, the sky hung gray and low, mirroring her mood, and Eleanor found herself remembering the first time Daniel brought Claire home, how proud he looked standing beside her, how gently Claire spoke, how she held Daniel's hand as if it were something precious, and Eleanor had believed, truly believed, that her son had found safety and love, the kind that lasted. Yet lately, subtle changes unsettled her, changes she could not explain but could not ignore either, like how Claire's messages had grown shorter, how family visits were postponed again and again, how Daniel brushed off questions with soft laughs that felt practiced. Eleanor told herself she was imagining things. That worry was simply the price of motherhood, but as the minutes ticked by in that quiet kitchen, a heavier thought took shape, one she did not want to name, because naming it would make it real. She rose from the table and walked to the window, watching a neighbor load groceries into a car, an ordinary scene that somehow made her chest ache more, because ordinary life was supposed to be safe, predictable, and yet she knew how easily it could shift, how quickly trust could turn fragile. She thought about calling Daniel again but stopped, fearing she might sound desperate. Fearing worse that she might hear something in his voice that confirmed her silent fear. Instead, she replayed moments from her last visit, the way Claire had excused herself to take a call, the way Daniel watched her leave the room with a look Eleanor could not place, not anger, not love, but uncertainty, and Eleanor's heart had tightened then too, though she forced a smile and stayed quiet. Now, alone with her thoughts, she realized that silence had only allowed her worry to grow, filling the space with questions that refused to stay buried. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the weight of years and responsibility settle on her shoulders, because being a mother never came with an ending, only new versions of fear, and this one felt sharp and urgent. Eleanor promised herself she would not sit back and wait while something precious slipped away, not again, not when she recognized the signs too well, signs she once ignored in her own life until it was too late. The idea formed slowly but firmly in her mind that she needed to see Daniel, to look into his eyes and hear the truth from his voice, because distance and unanswered calls were no longer enough to quiet her heart. As the dryer buzzed and the house fell into deeper silence, Eleanor made a decision that felt both loving and dangerous, a step she believed was meant to protect her son but that carried consequences she could not yet imagine. And as she picked up her phone with steady hands and booked a train ticket north, she had no idea that this single choice, born from fear and love, would change the bond between mother and son forever. Daniel Parker lived in a bustling Toronto neighborhood, a city alive with the hum of traffic and the rhythm of lives moving fast, yet inside his apartment, the air often felt quieter than the streets below, a quiet that carried tension he could not easily explain, and Eleanor could feel it the moment she stepped off the train, suitcase in hand, heart full of determination and worry. Daniel welcomed her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, the way people do when they want to seem fine but are carrying private burdens, and Eleanor noticed immediately that something had shifted between him and Claire, his wife. who greeted her politely, hugging her with warmth that felt practiced, measured, careful, as if she were trying not to reveal too much. The first few hours passed with casual conversation, small talk about the city, work, and family. Yet Eleanor's eyes caught subtle signs she couldn't ignore. Claire's phone constantly buzzing, messages. Glanced at nervously, a coat left on the couch that wasn't Daniel's. The way Claire's laughter fell short and Daniel's attention flicked anxiously toward her. Eleanor's motherly intuition, honed by years of experience, whispered that something private, something fragile, was happening, and she could feel a knot growing in her stomach. She tried to brush it off, telling herself that appearances can deceive and that city life often comes with distractions, but the tension in the apartment felt tangible, pressing against her, like a quiet storm about to break. Eleanor watched them carefully over the next day, noticing the small rituals that had changed, shared glances between Daniel and Claire that seemed cautious rather than intimate, Claire's sudden need to leave the room when her phone rang, Daniel's distracted manner when she asked about their plans, and every observation added weight to Eleanor's growing anxiety, because she remembered too well how subtle signs can hide deep hurt. And she feared the worst without fully knowing it. Late that afternoon, while Daniel was in the kitchen preparing coffee, Eleanor heard a soft voice she didn't recognize, faint but intimate, coming from Claire's room through the half-open door, a voice careful yet tender, and her heart lurched as she pressed an ear closer, catching fragments like, "I can't talk now, not like this," and she froze, unsure if she had crossed a line by listening, but the words confirmed the sense of danger she had carried from Ohio, the idea that something might be breaking her son's happiness. Eleanor spent the evening trying to remain calm, sharing stories with Daniel about work and old family memories, laughing quietly at anecdotes from his childhood, while her mind raced with questions, trying to piece together the hints, the silences, the hidden conversations, attempting to protect him before harm could touch his heart. She remembered her own past, the heartbreak she had endured when someone she trusted deeply had betrayed her, and she felt the familiar pang of maternal urgency, that desperate need to shield her child from the pain she knew all too well. She decided she would speak to Daniel directly, but first she wanted more evidence, more understanding, wanting to ensure her warning was grounded in reality, not fear alone, and she watched them carefully the next morning, noticing Claire's distracted glances and Daniel's quiet patience, the way he seemed unaware of Eleanor's growing tension but also strangely calm in ways that made Eleanor doubt her instincts for a moment. By mid-afternoon, Eleanor could no longer contain her concern and approached Claire in the kitchen, asking casually about work and their week, noting how Claire's eyes shifted, a flicker of something Eleanor couldn't name, something that hinted at secrecy or planning, and the unease in Eleanor's chest deepened, her mind spinning through possible scenarios, imagining heartbreak, lies, or betrayal, feeling both protective and helpless as she tried to read the subtle language of the people she loved most. Eleanor decided to wait for a private moment with Daniel, believing that as his mother, she had the right, even the responsibility, to guide him if danger lurked, and she spent the evening observing the household's routines, noting how Claire's movements seemed calculated, polite, careful, and how Daniel's patience, quiet and composed, masked an inner tension that only a mother might detect, and every observation made Eleanor more convinced that her presence here was necessary, that she needed to intervene before any potential heartbreak reached him. That night, Eleanor sat by the window of their small living room, the Toronto skyline glittering beyond, her thoughts spinning with worry and speculation, trying to reconcile the signs she had noticed with the image of her son as a happy, loving husband, realizing that life was complicated and people's actions were not always what they seemed, yet she felt a mother's instinct urging her to act, to speak, to protect. The next morning brought an opportunity. Claire left the apartment for an appointment, leaving Daniel and Eleanor alone, and Eleanor seized the moment, taking a deep breath, her heart pounding as she prepared to ask the questions that could either save her son from imagined danger or shatter the fragile trust between them. And as she opened her mouth to speak, Daniel looked at her with those calm, thoughtful eyes, and Eleanor realized that whatever truth awaited, she had to face it fully, because the bond between mother and son demanded honesty, courage, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable realities. Even in the midst of love and family, Eleanor Parker sat across from Daniel at his favorite small cafe, the one he had taken her to countless times during childhood visits, and she felt a mix of anxiety and urgency pressing her chest as she stirred her coffee, watching him quietly as he sipped, his posture tense yet composed, the way he always carried himself when deep in thought, and she realized she had never fully prepared for this moment, never rehearsed the exact words that could protect her son without crossing a line, but the worry that had driven her from Ohio to Toronto now demanded honesty, courage, and clarity, so she began softly, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. "Danny, are you happy?" Daniel looked up sharply, startled, his brown eyes meeting hers with surprise and a hint of defensiveness, and for a moment Eleanor feared she had overstepped, that her presence alone might create the tension she sought to resolve, yet she pressed on, choosing gentleness over accusation, knowing that any confrontation needed care, empathy, and truth. She explained carefully what she had noticed over her visit, the sudden distance between Daniel and Claire, the phone call she had overheard, the polite but measured ways Claire interacted with him, and she avoided using words like cheating or betrayal, instead framing her concern as maternal instinct, something born from love and past heartbreak. And Daniel listened quietly, hands wrapped around his mug, eyes fixed on her face, absorbing every word without interrupting, and Eleanor felt a flicker of hope that he might understand her intent even if the delivery felt blunt. She leaned forward, trying to soften the tension, saying, "I only want to protect you, Danny, because I've seen how hearts can break, and I can't bear to see yours hurt the way mine was." And she watched as his expression shifted subtly, a shadow of emotion crossing his face that she couldn't immediately identify, a mixture of grief, patience, and something quieter, something that told her he had already carried burdens she could not yet see, and it made her heart tighten further. Daniel finally spoke, slowly, deliberately, choosing each word with care. "Mom, why would you think that? Why assume something is wrong?" Eleanor's stomach dropped, realizing that her fears, though genuine, had already cast a shadow of doubt in her son's mind, and she felt a pang of guilt even as she tried to explain. "I only noticed changes, small signs. I thought, maybe I overreacted, but I had to say something." Daniel shook his head slightly, his lips pressed together, eyes searching hers, and said, "I wish you had trusted me enough to ask before assuming." And Eleanor felt the weight of those words like a quiet thunderclap. Because they were not harsh or angry, but honest, precise, and painful, cutting through her certainty and forcing her to confront that love alone could not justify interference. She opened her mouth to respond, but he continued, "Mom, to save me, or to save yourself from your past? That's the question you need to answer." And Eleanor froze, realizing that he had glimpsed the fear and unresolved pain she carried from her own history, the fear that had pushed her into this moment, and she had to acknowledge that her love, though genuine, was entangled with memory and caution, and that clarity, not anxiety, was what Daniel needed most. She took a deep breath, letting the cafe's quiet background noise fill the space between them, noticing the clink of cutlery, the soft murmur of other patrons, the smell of fresh coffee and pastries, and felt how fragile this conversation had become, how quickly a mother's concern could be misunderstood, how carefully one had to balance love, fear, and respect for another adult's life. Daniel's next words were softer, almost a whisper, carrying weight Eleanor could not ignore. "I know you love me, Mom. I know you want to protect me. But this isn't your burden to carry alone. I am capable, and I need to handle this myself." Her chest tightened further, tears threatening but not falling, because the realization hit her fully. She had thought she was protecting him, but in doing so, she might have undermined his trust, his agency, the relationship he shared with Claire, and for the first time, Eleanor saw that love sometimes required restraint, patience, and faith in those we cherished. She wanted to argue, to convince him, to insist that her instincts were right, but she remembered the quiet, steady way he had grown into a man capable of deep loyalty, empathy, and wisdom, and she bit her lip, swallowing words that might fracture the delicate bridge between them, realizing that he had already begun to teach her something profound about respect and boundaries, about trust and timing. The conversation shifted naturally then, not abruptly, but subtly, as Eleanor allowed herself to listen more than speak, as Daniel described his day, the pressures at work, his own awareness of changes in Claire's behavior. And Eleanor noticed the patience in his tone, the gentleness in his voice when he spoke of his wife, and she realized that despite her fears, Daniel had observed, reflected, and made choices with care, and that her role now was not to intervene but to support, quietly, without judgment. Yet even as relief softened the edges of her anxiety, Eleanor could not ignore the tension lingering in her chest, the feeling that the truth she sought was still partly hidden, like a delicate thread she needed to follow without pulling too hard, and she promised herself she would wait, watch, and learn more, because rushing could undo the progress of this fragile, honest dialogue. The cafe grew busier, the barista calling names, the clatter of cups and dishes, and Eleanor felt a strange mix of normalcy and intensity, aware that life outside continued in its ordinary pace, while inside, this conversation, this quiet reckoning, carried immense significance, shaping the path of her relationship with Daniel, her understanding of him as an adult, and the boundaries she needed to respect to truly support him. As they stood to leave, Eleanor felt both a pang of worry and a flicker of hope, realizing that her son's honesty, his willingness to confront her with gentle truth, was more powerful than any assumption she could make, and that the journey ahead would require patience, humility, and trust. Lessons she had learned painfully in her own life but now had the chance to apply with care. Walking back to Daniel's apartment, the streets of Toronto alive with evening lights, Eleanor reflected on the fragile beauty of adult relationships, how love intertwined with fear could mislead even the most attentive heart, and how letting go, even partially, could open space for understanding, forgiveness, and renewed connection, leaving her both anxious and quietly hopeful for the days to come. Knowing that this conversation marked a turning point in their bond, a moment where honesty and respect began to redefine the path forward, gently but irrevocably. After the cafe conversation, Eleanor felt a strange mix of relief and lingering worry, knowing she had spoken her truth but still uncertain about what lay beneath the surface of Daniel and Claire's marriage. And the next morning, she found the opportunity to uncover answers presenting itself in a way she hadn't expected. Claire had stepped out early for an appointment, leaving Daniel and Eleanor alone in the apartment, and the quiet space between them felt charged, heavy with unspoken thoughts. So Eleanor finally gathered her courage and asked gently, "Danny, can you tell me exactly what's going on? I need to understand." Daniel looked at her steadily, his eyes calm yet serious, as though he had anticipated this moment, and he began slowly, choosing each word with care, explaining that Claire had not been unfaithful, that the signs Eleanor had noticed were not hints of betrayal but part of something entirely different, something deliberate and thoughtful that Eleanor could not have guessed. Daniel revealed that Claire had been working on a private project for him, a deeply personal and loving surprise, a quiet renewal of their vows, meant to celebrate their marriage and the choice to stay together through a difficult year, and he described how Claire had been coordinating with a counselor and a jeweler, planning a moment that was intimate and meaningful, something neither Eleanor nor Daniel's friends would have expected, and the pieces fell into place in Eleanor's mind, each subtle sign, each guarded glance, each secretive phone call explained not by deception but by care and love, and she felt her heart both swell and ache at once, realizing that she had almost misread everything. He continued, telling her that the phone calls Eleanor overheard had been with the counselor, conversations about timing and emotions, and that Claire's distant moments were moments of preparation, ensuring that every detail honored their shared life and the depth of commitment they felt for each other. And Eleanor listened, absorbing the truth with a mixture of awe and embarrassment, recognizing the gap between her assumptions and reality, and the weight of her earlier fears pressed on her for a moment before giving way to a deeper understanding. Daniel's voice softened, gentle but firm, as he looked at her and said, "Mom, I know you were trying to protect me, and I understand why, but you need to trust me and Claire. Sometimes what looks like distance or secrecy is actually love and thoughtfulness." And Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes, knowing that he spoke not in anger but with the clarity of someone who had grown into his own sense of responsibility and trust, someone who understood love as a partnership that required patience, faith, and freedom. And she realized that her instinct to protect, while born from experience and care, had almost disrupted something delicate and beautiful. She swallowed hard, her mind replaying every moment of her visit, the subtle changes, the half-hidden smiles, the brief distractions, and saw now that Daniel's composure had been quiet strength, that Claire's careful movements had been a form of devotion, and that her motherly fears, though sincere, had misinterpreted signs of deep affection. And in that realization, she understood a lesson about trust, boundaries, and the quiet ways love expresses itself when it is sincere and considered. Daniel reached out, placing a hand over hers, and said softly, "Mom, I know you want to help, but this time, you need to step back. Love sometimes means letting others make their own choices, even when you worry, and Eleanor felt the weight of his words settle in her chest, a mix of pride and humility, because she knew he was right, and the truth of his insight resonated deeply, echoing lessons she had learned too late in her own life. The morning passed into afternoon, and Eleanor watched Daniel carefully, noting how he moved through the apartment with confidence and care, how he spoke to Claire when she returned with a warmth that left no room for doubt, and she realized that their love was stronger for the challenges they had faced together and for the small, intentional acts of planning that had been invisible to outsiders. She thought about how easily misunderstandings can arise when fear and love collide, how assumptions can cloud judgment even when intentions are pure, and she promised herself she would remember this moment, the clarity and humility it brought, and carry it forward as a guide for how to support her son without imposing her past experiences onto his present. Daniel continued to explain the reasoning behind Claire's secrecy, the excitement of creating a meaningful, private memory, and how they both had navigated challenges in their relationship with respect, patience, and shared commitment, and Eleanor listened with full attention, feeling her chest loosen as the tension she had carried for weeks began to dissipate, replaced by a profound admiration for the thoughtfulness and love between them. He paused and looked at her, eyes steady and kind, saying, "I hope you see now that this isn't about hiding, it's about cherishing. Claire and I trust each other, and that trust is what makes us strong." And Eleanor nodded, tears rolling silently, understanding not only the truth of the situation but also the broader lesson that love, in all its forms, requires faith, patience, and the willingness to step back and observe rather than intervene. Even when fear urges action, she realized that her journey to Toronto, her late-night worries, her desire to protect, had brought her to a moment of clarity, a moment where she could witness the beauty of trust and intentional love, and in that space, Eleanor understood that her role as a mother was evolving, that she could support Daniel without overstepping, and that sometimes the hardest part of love was letting go enough to allow others to create their own happiness. The day ended with a quiet, shared understanding between them, a bond reinforced not by intervention but by honesty, by patience, and by the recognition that Daniel had grown into a man capable of deep commitment and careful thought. And Eleanor left the apartment that evening with a heart both lighter and fuller, knowing that she had witnessed something rare and precious, that love could be expressed in subtle, invisible ways, and that her son's marriage, far from being threatened, had been strengthened by the very care she had misinterpreted, leaving her humbled, grateful, and profoundly moved by the unspoken lessons of trust, respect, and the quiet power of intentional love.